Good afternoon, everyone. Kindly settle down. We're going to start in 1 minute. Okay. I guess it would take less than a minute. Well, thank you very much for attending this afternoon's affair. Good afternoon to everyone. May I please request everyone to stand up for the singing of our national anthem.
Bayang magiliw, pelas ng silanganan, alab ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bughang, ang dilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kisap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim, lupa ng araw ng walhati't pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mang-aapi, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Thank you, Ms. Ina Moralejo. Ms. Ina is a member of the UP Concert Chorus. You may now take your seats. Let me begin by greeting everyone in this auditorium and our 100 plus participants on Zoom. A very good afternoon. Here they are, our participants on Zoom. Very excited to hear from our speaker and other speakers this afternoon. We also have participants who are watching our live stream through the UP School of Economics official YouTube channel. Okay. Welcome to the third lecture of the PCED at 50 lecture series, 50 Years of Economic Policy Making. This event is presented to you by the UP School of Economics and the Philippine Center for Economic Development. I'm your host for today, Christian Esguerra. Now, almost 5 decades ago, on May 13, 1974, the Philippine Center for Economic Development, or the PCED, was created. Now, in pursuit of its mandate, the PCED has supported the UP School of Economics in its efforts to provide quality economic education, training, and research that aid national economic policy making. Now, with PCED's financial and moral support, the school has become the melting pot of different disciplines and studies for fresh ideas and approaches ascertain national economic development. Now, in celebration of the PCED's illustrious history and achievements, this lecture series was crafted. The PCED at 50 lecture series will run from May to November 2023 and will feature the talks of former heads of the National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA, namely Dr. Sikat, Professor Monsod, our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Habito, Dr. Medalla, Dr. Canlas, Dr. Balisacan, and Dr. Pernia. And today we hold the third lecture of the series. Now, to introduce our main speaker, may I call Dr. Fernando Aldaba, the Dean of the School of Social Sciences of Ateneo de Manila University.
Thank you, Christian. So today, I'm honored to introduce a highly esteemed colleague, friend, and a stalwart in the field of economics, Professor Cielito Habito. Currently, he is a distinguished full professor of economics at the Ateneo de Manila University, while also serving as a senior fellow at the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. In addition to his academic role, He presides as chairman of the consultancy think tank Brain Trust Incorporated and Operation Compassion Philippines. His thought leadership extends to his weekly op-ed column, No Free Lunch, in the Philippine Daily Inquirer, a testament to his relentless dedication to economic discourse, now marking its 20th year. From 1992 to 1998, he honorably served as the youngest cabinet member under President Fidel V. Ramos' administration, holding the title of Secretary of Socio-Economic Planning and heading the National Economic and Development Authority. He is the second longest serving head of NEDA, 6 years, next only to Dr. Gerardo Sicat, who headed the agency for 11 years under President Marcos Sr. Shell has been the only one to serve a full 6-year presidential term since. Prior to his government service, he was a respected professor and chair at the Department of Economics at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Shell's extensive global experience spans fellowships in prestigious institutions such as Harvard University, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies in Kyoto University, and the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. He has been an invaluable advisor to various development agencies like the World Bank, ADB, USAID, OSAID, JICA, UNICEF, providing guidance to governments in the Asia-Pacific and Latin American regions. His business acumen is demonstrated through his service on the boards of multiple renowned companies, including FirstGen, Sun Life Prosperity Funds, Manila Water Company, Metrobank, and Phil Steel Holdings, among others. Currently, he leads as chair of the governing board of the Jakarta-based Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and holds membership on various boards, including the Management Association of the Philippines, the Ramon Magsaysay Award Foundation, JICA Philippines Advisory Committee, and the World Bank Philippines CSO Advisory Group. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Asian Journal of Agriculture and Development. Furthermore, he has undertaken important roles in civil society organizations such as the Knights of Columbus, Galing Pook Foundation, Clean Air Asia, and the Learning Community Organizations of Peace. In terms of his academic pedigree, Professor Habito earned his PhD in economics and MA in economics from Harvard University, where he crafted a seminal doctoral dissertation titled Equity and Efficiency Trade-offs in Philippine Tax Policy Analysis, a CGE or a General Equilibrium Approach, building the first CGE model of the Philippines. Additionally, he holds a Master of Economics from the University of New England in Australia and a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños in 1975, where he graduated as the lone summa cum laude in the entire UP system that year. Beyond his professional accomplishments, Shell is a dedicated family man, being a loving husband to Pilar Relova and father to 5 children, including twin boys, cleverly named MR and MC, a nod to a well-known equation in microeconomics. His family is a melting pot of cultures, with his twin sons married to Korean women and his 2 daughters married to a Japanese American and a Chinese American. This gives their family dynamics a global perspective and the charm of a K-drama and a telenovela. Shell and Pilar nowadays are also busy doing apostolate work with 9 grandchildren and counting. Together with Pilar, Shell has also been a cornerstone in fostering positive change with their local community in Los Baños. Their compassionate efforts have culminated in various impactful initiatives such as a mobile children's library, the establishment of primary schools in disadvantaged areas, and a specialized education program catered to autistic children. Additionally, they have championed entrepreneurial training for the less fortunate and instigated beneficial teacher development programs. A passionate advocate for child nutrition, Shell deplores the prevalent issues of malnutrition, stunting, and wasting in our society, ardently pushing for interventions to address these concerns. So it is with great respect and admiration that I ask you to join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Cielito Habito.
Thank you so much, Nandi. Of course, Professor Nandi Aldaba, a esteemed colleague in Ateneo. That was a very generous introduction, pang commission on appointments. Ano? Pero wala na akong hangat na bumalik pa sa pamahalaan. Well, first, let me dispense with the usual salutations because I'm always afraid I'll miss somebody. So I'll just say magandang hapon sa ating lahat. I'm glad to see fellow members of the Ramos Cabinet, former colleagues at the NEDA, my Ateneo colleagues, of course, my fellow economists in the UP School of Economics, and I suppose there may be a couple of students here as well. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge members of my family who have taken time out to join me here, my wife Pilar, my granddaughter Carla Habito, who's a student right now at the Philippine Science High School, and my youngest daughter, Carla Melissa Habito Son. She's the one married to a Chinese American. Okay. Well, thank you again for having me, and this is really an exciting series, frankly, and truly a good way to re-educate ourselves on the history, the economic history of our country. Now, today I'd like to share some stories with you on what we did on the economy in the 1990s, particularly within the 6-year presidency of Fidel V. Ramos. That's in 1992 to 1998, which of course many of us fondly look back to with a great degree of nostalgia. It was a period when there seemed to be a general feeling of renewed hope in the future of the country, especially as we built further on the accomplishments of the Cory Aquino administration. And that's why my alternate title for my talk today was Fond Memories of an Era of Hope. Well, as many would describe it, President Cory accomplished the restoration of democratic processes, while President Ramos, in turn, more vigorously pursued economic restoration, as the dictatorship had left the country's economy badly battered and lagging behind its erstwhile peers. And it was at that juncture that I found myself entrusted to be the country's chief socioeconomic planner at the young age of 39. I used to half-jokingly say then that it probably made sense for President FDR to entrust the planning job to a young person, as I would still be around to suffer the results if the plan was botched. Well, a young planner indeed would have a more direct stake in the plan that he or she formulates. So I humbly took on that task. Now, by the way, please know that since the time of Ernie Pernia at NEDA, the titles Director General and Deputy Director General and Assistant Director General have been dispensed with in favor of the formal cabinet title of Secretary for Socioeconomic Planning, Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary. And the reason for this is that even I, during my time, suffered from the misunderstanding overseas, where the title Director General is usually a 3rd or 4th level rank in the bureaucracy. So it's better that we address Secretary Balisacan now as Secretary Balisacan. By the way, not even Secretary General. Yung parang pinaghalo yung Secretary at Director General. So just for everybody's little information, it was at the start of the term of President Duterte when Ernie Pernia asserted this change. Now, President Ramos started his presidency with a clear vision he wanted to achieve, summed up in two phrases: people empowerment and world competitiveness. And some of us initially hesitated with the word world or global in this phrase, as that might sound rather ambitious or even audacious. So international competitiveness seemed more manageable to some of us. Well, in the end, those three words were used interchangeably at the time for that second theme of the Ramos vision. And then came Philippines 2000, our take on Japan Inc. at the time, a term widely heard at that time. Now, the phrase did not come from us at NEDA, and admittedly, there was some initial resistance there. At the time, my people perhaps were worried that it might upstage the medium-term Philippine Development Plan, or what we still call the MTPDP at the time, that we had worked so hard on. But as I'll tell you later, after having built bridges already with the people behind the Philippines 2000 trademark, which I'll talk about also later on, I told my people then that we should consider Philippines 2000 as the branding for the MTPDP. And I see my friend and discussant today, Serafin Talisayon, smiling broadly because they were the guys behind Philippines 2000. Now, President Ramos summarized his development strategy in his 5 Ds: devolution, decentralization, democratization, deregulation, and development that is sustainable. And that's the way he would say it, para lang maging D pa rin yung panglima. No? Well, of course, it's better known as sustainable development. So I will walk briefly through each of these in a while. Now, about midway through his term, we also defined so-called pole vaulting strategies, meant precisely to pole vault above our dynamic neighbors. It meant pursuing a wish list, and it was admitted to be a wish list of things we wanted to be: Asia's Knowledge Center, Culture and Arts Center, a shopping mecca, a financial center, a maritime and shipping power, energy exporter, medical center, and food basket. Well, Knowledge Center alluded to being both a center for education and information technology, which we had been strong on. In fact, a lot of foreigners used to come to the country to be educated. Culture and Arts Center included becoming known as the Broadway of Asia, as we learned at the time that Singapore was actually hiring our stage actors, directors, and even stage crew to stage Broadway productions there. Now, to become like Hong Kong and Singapore as target shopping destinations was one of the aims of our retail trade liberalization law, which opened us to large global retail chains. Banking liberalization also at the time aimed to position our country as a regional financial center, like Hong Kong was then and still is. There was logic in aspiring to be a maritime and shipping center as well, as we are an archipelagic country. And here, let me tell a quick story about Croatia, which I visited officially during my tenure. And my hosts were very proud, telling me, oh, we are a very important maritime center because we're an archipelago with 1,000 islands. And then I thought to myself, teka muna, we have 7,000 islands. Why can't I brag the same thing? So really, it's something that we had to think about because they made the most. They capitalized on their archipelagic nature. And they had a very strong shipbuilding industry, which we didn't have at the time, and so on. Now, being an energy exporter was inspired by the then vaunted potentials of harnessing ocean waves for power generation. And I wonder whatever happened to that, no? At that time, there was a lot of talk about ocean wave-generated energy. Now, being a regional medical center also made great sense, as we are known for superior medical professionals. And let me tell you another quick story here. At one time, the Harvard Medical School sent a little mission here, and President Ramos, I guess knowing that I was a graduate of Harvard, sent these guys to me for me to help them find contacts. They wanted to set up a training hospital of the Harvard Medical School in the Philippines. Well, let me fast forward to the conclusion. I later heard, months later, that they had decided to go to Singapore. And when I asked why, what I heard was that these guys were so disappointed everywhere they went. The first question they encountered was, "What's in it for me?" So that's the way we used to, we used to and we still lose a lot of potential foreign investors. Now, I considered the food basket ambition as the most ambitious and unrealistic then, because I was already anticipating how increased trade protection that was happening at the time, and we found it so hard to resist or to hold back. I knew that it would run counter to achieving this as a long-term dream. Now, the big difference with President Ramos was his leadership qualities, yet unmatched by any of his successors. In his very first cabinet meeting, he gave us a sermon on UST, Unity, Solidarity, and Teamwork. And this was right after his oath-taking in the Luneta. We cooped up in the state dining room and had a 3-hour cabinet meeting. He said he wanted a government of consensus. Policy differences were to be settled behind closed doors, not publicly, and especially not through the media. And his words were very clear. Once a consensus or decision is reached, anyone not happy with it should shut up or ship out. And I guess that's military language. He also explained his bibingka style of governance that involved fire at the bottom and fire at the top, meaning a proper combination of bottom-up and top-down elements in governance. Now, part of the metaphor also was how ingredients and garnishings for the bibingka are usually sourced widely within the community. So this denoted participatory formulation of policies, plans, programs, and projects. And such multi-stakeholder participation, as exemplified by his bibingka analogy, was something he consistently adhered to, manifested in his creation of the Philippine Council for Sustainable Development and later the Social Reform Council, and I will return to these. He was also known for the many so-called summits with wide participation, which he organized to tackle various governance and development issues. And then there were the 3 famous letters written with his trademark red flare pen, CSW, or completed staff work. He would send back documents to us, his officials, with those 3 letters on top when he considered our submissions half-baked or lacking sufficient analysis and consensus. Now, to achieve teamwork and consensus in every government decision and action, he created interagency committees, task forces, and councils at will. When I had my staff at NEDA take stock of all the various such interagency bodies we either chaired or were a member of, it was reported to me that there were 443. And that's a number that has stuck to my mind ever since. For example, I was assigned to chair a committee with a very specific task of determining how to use the areas covered by the Iwahig Penal Colony in Palawan. Now, at the other extreme, I was put on top of the Philippine Council for Sustainable Development, and I still get back to that. But he had another trick for getting small groups of cabinet members to reach agreement quickly when strong differences of opinion got in the way of a quick consensus. He would make us meet in this particularly small, windowless room near the Malacanang State Dining Room, where it would be so uncomfortable that we all wanted to hurry to reach a decision. It was only much later that we learned from him when he naughtily told us that he would actually instruct his aides to deliberately turn off the air conditioning in that room. The ploy worked every time. Indeed, that forced us to reach consensus and agreement very quickly. Of course, we all know his work ethic was legendary, and we could not but follow suit. He was up at 4 a.m., and he would be either making calls to us or sending instructions on marginal notes on fax newspaper clippings by 5 a.m. And he would do this whether we were here at home in the Philippines or abroad, whether with him or not. Let me now go into the dynamics and alliances surrounding the Ramos economic reforms. Good chemistry within the economic team, of course, was crucial. Around mid-June 1992, Peter Garucho, who was to be FBR's first executive secretary, asked me to meet with him and Finance Secretary designate Ramon Del Rosario Jr. at the Tivoli restaurant at the former Makati Mandarin. It was meant to see if Ramon and I were likely to be able to work together smoothly. And it was then that I was told that FBR wanted me to lead NEDA. Of course, Ramon and I have since been good friends and continue to work actively together, now as fellow trustees of the Ramon Magsaysay Award Foundation. But the same chemistry was maintained later with Bobby De Ocampo, as well as Roy Navarro at DTI, June Enriquez at DBM, Bobot Sebastian at the DA, Joey Quisha still at the Central Bank at the time, and even on to his successor, Gabi Singson, when it became BSP. Well, dear old Gabi was something else. He always carried a copy of the Bangko Sentral law asserting the independence of the Bangko Sentral inside his breast pocket, and would slap it heavily on the table to assert that we in the cabinet could not tell BSP what to do. And while we didn't always agree with one another, we didn't need that little room in Malacanang to reconcile our policy differences. Now, my friends here in the UP School of Economics faulted me then for not playing golf, where it seemed some crucial economic policies were sealed. Actually, that pressured me to take up golf lessons in the Malacanang Golf Club, arranged by my Philippine Science High School batchmate, Hermo Esperon, who was at the time with the Presidential Security Group. But I simply couldn't fit golf into my busy NEDA schedule then. Well, at the outset, I knew that General Joe Almonte was going to be a crucial ally. So he was the first, actually, among my cabinet peers that I invited to a private lunch, and we dined at Manila Hotel. Immediately, we discovered a convergence in our ideas and ideals, and we agreed that it was important for us to work closely together. Well, I have a little story on that later, on how we worked together. Around him was a small group of visionary intellectuals, one of whom is among our discussants today, and I hope he shares some interesting stories of his own as well. But extremely critical to President Ramos's reform program was close coordination with the legislature. And we institutionalized this through the creation by Congress of the Legislative Executive Development Advisory Council, or the LEDAC, whose creation we in NEDA pushed in Congress through the political skills of my then deputy, Chito Sobrepeña. And Chito, take a bow. Asa ba si Chito? He's here right now. There you are. So si Chito nag-shepherd niyan. Kaya tayo nagka-LEDAC. Chito was shepherding it through Congress at the time. Now, while LEDAC was only mandated to meet quarterly, FBR convened it every week, every early Wednesday morning, whenever Congress was in session. That gave NEDA a lot more work, being the secretariat to the LEDAC. And it also meant that I had to meet with the leaders of Congress, of both houses of Congress, at the Manila Hotel every Tuesday, just to flesh out the agenda for next morning's early meeting. Well, LEDAC proved so useful that we tried our luck for a similar JEDAC with the judiciary. Well, that proved to be a tougher nut to crack. Now, I won't tell you the story anymore about that, but again, it was not as easy. Now, tensions across government agencies are inevitable. Of course, it was quite palpable between NEDA and the CCPAP, or the Coordinating Council for the Philippine Assistance Program. And I think most of us know it is one of the major reasons why Winnie Monsod resigned her NEDA post. Because, of course, CCPAP duplicated a key NEDA function. Now, NEDA had occasional policy differences with the Bangko Sentral as well, and I'll touch on that later. At one time, we had to referee between the DPWH and the DOTC to overcome a months-long stalemate over who was to go over and under where the new C5 at the time and the Aurora Boulevard, the MRT2 on Aurora Boulevard, would cross each other in Katipunan. Now, DA and DTI also fought over trade policy, And I'll say more on this later. So NEDA, as an oversight agency, constantly had to take a mediator or referee role in such interagency dynamics. Well, pursuing Ramos's economic reforms was not going to be easy. Resistance to change is natural, and intensifying the trade liberalization already begun under President Cory met with both vocal and silent opposition. Early in my tenure at NEDA, a big industrialist barged into my office, wagging his finger at my nose, chiding me for killing his firm and killing his industry with trade liberalization. 5 years later, I witnessed him singing a different tune, publicly thanking and praising President Ramos to high heavens in a forum, in a public forum, and declaring how his liberalization policy had led him to shape up, and now he was exporting his products to Latin America. I like to tell this story every time I meet with people who tend to be protectionists. And then there was this fight over raising petrochemical tariffs, something I and some cabinet allies vigorously resisted because an insider informer had told us that the proponent investor could actually afford to pay those higher tariffs. But they only wanted to recover their investment much, much sooner than the 5 to 7 years that had been reported to their board as the recovery period. When the Interagency Tariff and Related Matters Committee, or TRM, of the NEDA board held a public hearing on the matter, this is where I quietly sought help from Joe Al. And I think Apin was part of that as well. And lo and behold, during the hearing itself, a sizable group of farmers showed up and argued how higher petrochemical tariffs would raise the cost of their inputs, ranging from irrigation hoses to the plastic jute-like sacks that they bag their rice with. We never granted those higher tariffs that they sought under President Ramos. But they managed to get their way under a succeeding president, who not only froze the tariff reductions that we were putting in place, but also turned back the clock on our program phase down to a uniform 5% tariff by 2004. Well, I have more stories than I have time for here, but these include how provincial governors amusingly fought to be counted among the 20 poorest provinces of the country when President Ramos had a program for the 20 poorest provinces, thinking, I guess, that it would bring them more budgets. And then how civil society members of the PCED initially opposed representation therein by the private sector, on the argument that government was already pushing for the interests of business sector anyway. I believe we convinced them otherwise with our actions, and eventually we had 2 representatives from business sitting in the Philippine Council for Sustainable Development, including Prime Minister Cesar Virata. Devolution, let me start with the 5 Ds. Devolution meant asserting the sound governance principle of subsidiarity that was upheld in the Local Government Code of 1991, enacted by Ramos's predecessor, of course, President Cory Aquino. It holds that decisions and actions are best undertaken at levels of governance closest to the problems they seek to address. It was remarkable how President Ramos caused a palpable change of attitude among local government leaders through his tenure. Early in his term, public forums on his provincial trips, with some of us cabinet members always in tow, typically had local politicians presenting him with wish lists of assistance being sought from the national government. But he was no Santa Claus. His typical response was to challenge them to cook their bibingka with fire from the bottom, complemented by fire from the top, and combining ingredients contributed by various stakeholders in true working partnerships. So he would leave them with his trademark thumbs up challenge. Kaya ba natin ito? Of course, the crowd would shout out, thumbs up, kaya! I was personally amazed at how towards the end of his term, those same public forums in the provinces no longer had local leaders presenting him with wish lists. Instead, they were giving proud reports on what they had effectively done for themselves. Now, was that self-help attitude to last? Well, sadly, that's another story. Decentralization, the second D, pertained to a wider dispersal of economic activity across the country. Ramos's first order of business was to give long overdue preferential attention to Mindanao. When I called his attention in 1992 to how Mindanao only received 9% of the infrastructure budget in the infrastructure budget we inherited, he directed the tripling of this share by 1995, and we did it. He established the Mindanao Economic Development Council, or MEDCO, which was upgraded in 2010 by law to the Mindanao Development Authority, or now MINDA, which was to oversee development in that lagging southern island group. He also caused the crafting of the Mindanao 2000 Development Framework Plan. His decentralization thrust also included establishment of regional agro-industrial centers, or RAICs, in all administrative regions of the country. He strengthened the regional development councils as coordinating bodies for regional development. And like his predecessor, he appointed a cabinet officer for rural development, or CORD, for every region of the country to act as the chief shepherd in the cabinet for initiatives for his or her assigned region. Now, wanting to bring government closer to the people, he held frequent full cabinet meetings out in the regions. And each time we did that, groups of cabinet members first had to go on field immersion visits, reporting their observations later in the full cabinet meeting in the afternoon. It was actually through these immersion visits that I got my prized rare experience of having visited Kalayaan Island, leading a small cabinet contingent then. I recall how the runway there is so short that the C-130 pilot simply has to drop the plane down once he gets to the beginning of the runway. No matter how far from the ground, the plane still was. And you can imagine the big bump this forced touchdown made. At another time, that decrepit Air Force Fokker propeller plane, taking us, the cabinet, back from a Mindanao cabinet meeting, developed engine trouble, forcing an unplanned landing in Mactan. So they serviced the plane, and after it was serviced, we were taxiing to take off to resume the flight, when suddenly everything conked out as if somebody unplugged the power. Well, we all ended up being herded to various PAL flights in Mactan back to Manila, and we all got home very late that night. So yes, those regional cabinet meetings often proved to be scary as well. Now, democratization was all about letting the small people have their voice, and small businesses face a level playing field with the big guys. Joe Almonte was known, of course, for his crusade to break up cartels and monopolies, and the first targets were the telecommunications and domestic civil aviation. Well, on telecoms, I like to tell the story of how my wife had applied for our PLDT line in Los Baños in 1984, soon after my return from my PhD studies, and how we finally got our line only 6 years later, and only because I had become the NEDA Assistant Director-General at the time, and I happened to be in a meeting, one of the top officials of PLDT, who of course I whispered to about our long pending application. Well, lo and behold, within 2 days, we had our telephone line. So, of course, they were telling us all excuses like, oh, your house is too far from the, kaya naman pala sa 2 araw kung talagang gusto. So, I was later to argue with PLDT and then with PAL that opening their industries up to competition actually led to industry growth that made their slice of the pie, their slice of the now divided bibingka, even bigger than the entire bibingka that they used to control themselves. So, democratization really worked. Democratization was the aim also of our then mantra of broad-based development. And I believe this is the precursor of the term inclusive growth and development, which I think World Bank President James Wolfenson was the one who popularized. No? I found myself debating a senator who publicly argued for an export armada approach to our economic growth, meaning focus our attention and our resources on a few fast-growing export products, support them to the hilt, and let the rapid growth trickle down to the bottom. I argued that trickle-down does not work, and it was better to have wider participation in our growth at the outset, and hence wider benefits from it, even if it meant growth not as rapid as the export armada strategy that the senator was arguing for. Now, to enable small businesses, we pursued faithful implementation of the Magna Carta for SMEs passed under the Cory administration. When our country hosted the APEC meeting in 1996, President Ramos's tangible taya to the APEC was establishment in Los Baños of the APEC Center for Technology Exchange and Transfer for SMEs, with that unwieldy acronym ACTET-SME. Unfortunately, the DTI and later the UPLB, to which DTI passed it on to, failed to have it operate as envisioned by FVR. So right now, it's just a building whose spaces are being leased out. Deregulation. President Ramos assumed office, as we all know, at a time when we were suffering day-long brownouts due to severe power shortage. One of the key elements of his deregulation thrust thus came into play, what we used to call BOT, or Build, Operate, Transfer, and variants thereof. Of course, now they're generally called PPPs, or public-private partnerships, which assert the value of having the private sector do what it can do better than government can, and not have government compete with them. We actually practically invented BOT, or PPP, by having the first enabling legislation for it. But as a sort of guinea pig for this, he also faced the early pitfalls of this new mode of privatization. Now, later in the Ramos term, we moved on to the privatization of water services, and the Manila Water story was hailed as a unique model of successful water privatization worldwide. It was President Cory Aquino who began the aggressive trade and investment liberalization through the Foreign Investments Act of 1991, which shifted us to a more liberal negative list approach to our foreign investment policy, and then Executive Order 413, which comprehensively simplified and lowered import tariffs to just 4 levels. The House of Representatives resisted EO 413 and insisted that modifying tariffs was a congressional prerogative. Hence, as Dondon's deputy in 1991, I, together with then DTI Secretary Peter Garrucho, worked intensively for almost a year with the leaders in Congress to help hammer out the Republic Act that was supposed to promulgate Cory's sweeping tariff reform. After a year, the politicians decided they preferred that the president be the one to issue the new tariffs after they realized it would be a political hot potato. So they agreed to invoke the rule that the president may issue tariff modifications when Congress is not in session. So EO 413 was eventually issued by President Cory as EO 470, largely unchanged, except that the tariff reductions were to be phased down rather than reduced in one fell swoop, as Finance Secretary Jesse Stanislao at the time would have wanted it. Well, President Ramos wanted to move beyond that. And we put in place a further tariff phase down to a uniform 5% across the board to be reached by 2004, following the example of Chile, which had already adopted a uniform 3% tariff rate at the time. As I already mentioned earlier, that was later to be reversed, not only frozen under President Arroyo. On the foreign investments negative list, we moved to abolish the discretionary list C, because there was an A, B, C, with only lists A and B remaining. And these are the investments restricted by the Constitution or other existing laws like public utilities, mass media, educational institutions, advertising, and more. Of course, as you know, we have tackled the public utilities part by having an amendment to the Public Services Act that more narrowly defined public utilities to allow us to open up those that were taken out of that definition. We acceded to the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement early in the Ramos presidency, but the groundwork had been laid among the then 6 ASEAN members even beforehand, during the time of President Cory. And I recall, I was part of it. Undersecretary Lilia Bautista and I had to endure the embarrassment of having the Philippines called out in the ASEAN senior economic officials negotiations as being the drag to the AFTA negotiations then, along with Indonesia. Because we asked for too many exceptions, sensitive lists, and other deviations from what the rest of the ASEAN wanted. This undermined the economic integration that AFTA wished to accomplish. Now, President Ramos, of course, was also very enthusiastic about APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which culminated with our hosting of the annual gathering in 1996. At that time, my U.S. counterpart was Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, as chair of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. And so we worked together and put together, in fact, an APEC-wide meeting of chief economic advisors in Manila during that APEC hosting. And then there was the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program, or CTRP. And my dear friend Nene Guevara can tell you all about it. Nene is here as well. But what I remember most was how my young children were traumatized seeing their father publicly jeered on national TV in the Magandang Gabi Bayan program. There I had to explain the expansion of the VAT coverage under CTRP to a hostile studio audience. Now, there were senators and congressmen with me in the panel supposed to defend the legislation, but it turned out that rather than defend the measure with me, they chose instead to gang up on me after seeing the mood of the studio audience. So much for politicians. Sustainable development, the last of the 5 Ds. Ramos asserted his commitment to this through one of his earliest executive orders, EO number 15, creating the multi-stakeholder Philippine Council for Sustainable Development. It was the first such council in the world in the aftermath of the Rio Earth Summit in July of 1992, which called on countries worldwide to establish such national councils for sustainable development, or NCSDs. Our PCSD put civil society leaders like Maximo or Juni Calao and Dinky Soliman at the same table with cabinet members to deliberate on and recommend policies towards environmental, social, and economic sustainability in our development path. The PCSD crafted Philippine Agenda 21, the country's blueprint for sustainable development, in accordance with the Earth Summit commitments for the formulation also of National Agendas 21. But forward-looking as he was, President Ramos had also instructed NEDA to formulate a 25-year long-term plan. And we had this by 1997. It was called Plan 21, or sometimes we called it the Silver Plan because of the 25 years, which would bring the country into the 21st century. Never mind that it was to go well beyond President Ramos's own term of office. And of course, he was always accused, even with that moniker, Philippines 2000, he was always accused that he's actually intending to stay on to 2000. What more with this long-term plan there that was all the way until 2023, in effect. So this is still the last year of that long-term plan. Unfortunately, I think this is all but forgotten as of now. There was also the Human and Ecological Security Program that then DILG Secretary Rafi Alunan spearheaded, inspired after he attended a global conference on the topic. And through it, sustainability was brought to the agenda of local governance as well, with DILG spearheading it. And drawing on PCSD's experience in addressing environmental sustainability, President Ramos created a similar mechanism for social reform and poverty reduction via the Social Reform Agenda and the Multi-Stakeholder Social Reform Council headed by Secretary Ernie Garilao. He's here right now. By the way, he's the only other Ramos cabinet member who actually survived the entire 6-year term of President Ramos. Of course, not counting Joe Almonte, who was also there throughout the 6 years. Well, the SRC, the Social Reform Council under Ernie, later turned into the National Anti-Poverty Commission through a Republic Act of Congress. Now, everything seemed well and good. We had a very systematic plan, but the spoiler was something that came out of nowhere, and this was, of course, the Asian financial crisis. By the way, we had this document drawn up by Paul Krugman. This is at the start, in fact, at the transition between Cory Aquino's term and President Ramos's term. That book, Transforming the Philippine Economy, was authored by Paul Krugman, that Nobel-winning economist, and among those authors was our present Bangko Sentral Governor, Eli Remolona. Now, towards the end of the Ramos term, I decided to bring in the other luminary, Jeffrey Sachs, again with the support of UNDP. And among the things that I had hoped Jeff Sachs can help us do was to convince the Bangko Sentral that it was not such a good idea to maneuver to keep our exchange rate constant over 18 months. And this was a time when my friend, with all, bless his soul, all due respect, Gabi Singson was always proudly showing the Economist magazine in cabinet or NEDA board meetings, because that's where the Bangko Sentral governor can be, where the graph for the Philippine exchange rate was a horizontal straight line, which prompted me to write a confidential memo to the president explaining why the exchange rate must move with the inflation rate. Otherwise, if you keep it a straight line and there was inflation still ranging around 7%, we are actually making the peso less and less competitive over time. Well, that was a memo that was confidential but leaked out to the media. Anyway, this was among those policy differences that we had with the Bangko Sentral. But as we all know, we went through the Asian financial crisis relatively unscathed, at least as far as growth was concerned. Our GDP growth barely touched negative, while our neighbors were doing double-digit negative contractions at the time. Of course, we like to say then that, well, it's because we already had practice in the early 80s. We had our own financial crisis, a homegrown one, as a result of the assassination of Senator Benigno Aquino. Now, the economic slowdown because of the Asian financial crisis also, of course, threw a monkey wrench into our projections about our power requirements. So for a brief period, and only a brief period, we did have excess power. And then we were pilloried to no end by people who said, why did you have to provide for so much power? Look at what we're doing now. Because, of course, they were under take-or-pay arrangements. We're paying for power that we're not even using. So all of that was going. Of course, our answer was always, well, we had to do this because the most expensive power is no power at all. But again, that was one of the things that the Asian financial crisis, oops, did I disconnect it? Asian financial crisis messed up. So, what did we achieve? Well, let me just say, looking back, we had strong and improved economic fundamentals as a result of this very systematic, very deliberate strategy of the Ramos administration. If you look at the inflation rate, in fact, if you look at my PITIC test, presyo, trabajo, kita, everything was moving in the right direction. Inflation rate was moving down during that 92-98 period. Unemployment rate was moving down as well. GDP growth was moving up. And beyond PITIC, revenue and tax effort reached an all-time record, touching almost 20% in fact for revenues. If you look at that, the peak during the Ramos period was never repeated again so far. And I hope we are able to breach that again. And along with that, because of better tax collection, the consolidated public sector balance was largely balanced, and even slight surplus was achieved in 1996. Of course, it was bested during the time of President Noynoy Aquino when we had a considerable positive surplus in the budget, that part encircled in yellow. How about debt service? Well, debt service as a percent of budget and total revenues, again, went down throughout the Ramos term. Although it's not unique to the Ramos term, there was similar reductions even during President Cory's part and even the latter part of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and of course, during the time of President Noynoy Aquino. Gross fixed capital formation, aka total investment or total fixed investment, the growth was also moving up. And so truly, the major indicators were moving in the right direction. So to me, that was proof positive that the reforms had been working. Also, we had attained the fastest export growth versus our ASEAN peers. And here are the numbers. And I had to dig up these numbers because recently I led the team of our firm, Brain Trust Inc., that actually won the bid to do the Philippine Export Development Plan, recently launched by the President. And look at the numbers. If you look from 1992 to 1998, the Philippines tripled its export revenues, while our neighbors simply less than doubled theirs. Of course, if you look more closely, we were starting from a very low base. We were still way down below. No? But still, our rate of growth suddenly zoomed up. But the sadder part of the story is after 2000, if you look, for example, at the ratio of the 2020 figure to the 2000 figure, now we just raised ours by 1.7 times, whereas our neighbors increased their exports by more than double. In fact, I chose to exclude Vietnam from this table because mapapaiyak kayo. Kasi yung Vietnam had a 25-fold increase in their exports between 2000 and 2020. So again, a shameless plug on this PEDP that I actually led the team on. It has been described by some as overly ambitious. And in fact, even though we widely consulted the different export industries about what they felt they could achieve, ngayon parang dinidisown na nila yung targets because of the more recent developments, I guess. So the PEDP is admittedly ambitious, but I declare we cannot afford not to be ambitious. So we had unprecedented foreign direct investment growth under Ramos. Just look at that graph from 1980 to about 2000. It's very clear. Now, if you took a longer view, that's not, of course, the best in our entire history. But again, you can see that there. Obviously, we did a lot better between 2010 and 2016, and a little bit after 2016. The other things that we like to look back to are the fact that a lot of talent, expat Filipino talent, returned to the country. People like Dodo Banatao and other very important luminaries in the business sector actually chose to come back after many years of exile. We had a program called Science and Technology Advisory Councils. Our friend Poch Macaranas, who was the undersecretary at DFA at the time, was the one tasked with supervising this so that the Filipino expat experts were organized to be able to help the country even if they did not decide to repatriate themselves. And of course, we escalated the Balik Scientist program to bring back even more expert talent back home. The one thing I'm quite proud about, because I was directly part of it, was also the Philippines became a donor country at that time. I was visiting Myanmar on an official visit to visit my counterpart, my dear friend and the late General David Abel. And as we visited, our embassy people there were pointing out to us all the cranes for the construction of new buildings. And they told us, look, all of those are being run by Filipinos. So we were surprised. Well, there's no local capability even to operate this heavy equipment. And so we got the idea of offering scholarships for Myanmar scholars ranging from construction work, from construction equipment operation, all the way to graduate degrees in statistics and economics. So we had 60 Myanmar scholars come to the Philippines at that time, and all it took was a few million pesos from the PAGCOR fund of the president. So because it was within the discretion of the president, when I wrote a memo to the president suggesting this scholarship program for Myanmar, he readily approved it. And so for about 2 years, we had these Myanmar students here. And of course, there's a lot of interesting stories there as well. Kasi may isang nagtanan na in love sa isang Pilipina, biglang nawala for several weeks. But anyway, that's part of the story. But we are proud, and President Ramos had been so proud to also say that we were a donor country at that time, and we were being looked up to by Myanmar. Well, as I wind down, we all had a lot of things that remained to be done. In fact, a lot of things that got worse again. We still have that dysfunctional political system. We see it in expanding dynasties and continuing personality politics, weak transparency and accountability, regulatory, and what I even call obstructionist mindsets in our bureaucracy. And I like to say that our government people seem to be so creative in finding new hurdles to throw in our way, whether you're applying for a driver's license or whether getting a clearance or a permit for a small business. And then, of course, policy making continues to be captured by either the populist forces or those with big money. And our economic reforms have been either stalled or have been backsliding. I've already mentioned the tariff reform or trade liberalization. Competition policy took 3 decades. The first bill apparently was filed in 1987, and while Apin and company were fighting for it even then, it was only in 2016 that we finally got our competition law. There was also the continuing defiance of devolution. The Department of Agriculture, the DepEd, continued to be over-centralized, and recurrent and persistent protectionism, plus this fear of preferential trade arrangements. When the opportunity to join RCEP was there, what did we get? Well, a lot of resistance, and it was delayed by about a year or so when everybody else was rushing for that. And let me inform you, by the way, the Philippines has only 10 free trade agreements. Our neighbors all have anywhere from 15 to 27. And to me, that's already proof positive of why we have been so stagnant in our trade. Now, let me play this as towards the end. How do I activate this? Akala ko magpe-play siya automatically. Can you help me?
Now, many people are watching the elections you have on May 11th for a new president. President Ramos has implemented some economic reforms. What do you think the future of those reforms and future reforms will be in the next administration?
Well, frankly, John, I've always said that no matter who gets elected president in the next elections, we expect that the general directions, policy reforms we've undertaken, which have really brought a great deal of resilience to our economy, as shown by our experience in the past year, are going to be maintained, because there's been a general consensus in our society that that was the right way to go. And so, in fact, even the vice president himself, even the other candidates have indicated so, that they recognize the importance of the overall philosophy of our economic reforms.
Well, how wrong I was. Still, hope springs eternal. And if President Ramos was here and he would shout, "Kaya ba natin ito?" I think we would still want to say, "Kaya-kaya." But we do have to have a lot more hard work to make sure that kaya natin. Maraming salamat po. I forgot to show these 2 books I had in the slide. This is the Jeff Sachs book. This is the Paul Krugman book.
Thank you for that very insightful presentation. A lot of stories, a lot of good news mixed with a bad, a combination of optimism and realism. We'll talk more about that later on during the open forum. At this point, to further enrich our discussions on the topic, I'd like to introduce our 3 discussants. As I introduce you, please take your seats. Ito na ba? Later pa. Okay, sorry. Ito ba upuan na? Okay. This doesn't look that comfortable for them. Anyway, our first discussant is Mr. Emilio Neri Jr. Prior to his appointment as lead economist at the Bank of the Philippine Islands, he served as economics and banking sector analyst for a former Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas Monetary Board member. He was a consultant at the Asian Development Bank, was senior economics researcher and lecturer on monetary and fiscal policy at the University of Asia and the Pacific. The research team led by Mr. Neri consistently ranks at the top of survey for analysts conducted by Bloomberg, Asia Money, and The Asset. In 2019, he was awarded #1 Best Equities Economist and number 2 best fixed income economist by the Fund Managers Association of the Philippines. Our second discussant is Dr. Rene Ofreneo. He is a UP Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the School of Labor and Industrial Relations. He served as Undersecretary for Labor Relations of the Department of Labor and Employment from 1997 to 1998. Dr. Ofreneo is one of the leading scholars on labor relations and labor market studies in the Philippines and in the Asia-Pacific region. He sits in the editorial board of several international journals, and among his international publications are Asia in the Pacific, Advancing Decent Work Amidst Deepening Inequalities, and a Toolkit for Labor Law Reform Advocacy. Our third discussant is Dr. Serafin Talisayon. Dr. Serafin Talisayon is the current CEO and Director for Research and Development and Knowledge Innovation, expert of Community and Corporate Learning for Innovation, or CCLFI. He is known as the father of knowledge management, or KM, in the Philippines after co-founding CCLFI in 1999. He started the first knowledge management course at the University of the Philippines in 2001 and spearheaded the establishment of the KM Association of the Philippines in 2002. Kindly take your seats on stage for our discussants. Later. Okay. Okay, sige. We'd like to call Dr. Emilio Neri first. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very flattered to be invited in this event. I never thought I would be presenting anything in this auditorium in my entire life. By the way, Sir Alex Escucha wants to remind everyone that I was president of the Philippine Economic Society. He was also a president. Okay, same as, of course, Sir Shell. Yeah, so, well, the feeling is of, I guess, gratitude. We're very thankful for, for the economic team of President Ramos. They achieved so much with so little fiscal and external space during that time. And, we are in the private sector, we are very thankful for the opportunity to contribute to, to the development of the economy through participation in PPP. By the way, there are some familiar faces, but first I'd like to thank the family of Dr. Habito, because if it weren't for your support, Sir Shell would not have been able to deliver so well in his work. So that's, and then of course I'd like to say hi to Ma'am Nene Guevara, who is here. She was head of the task force on taxes, and my former boss and mentor, Emil Antonio, who passed away already, actually was a member of the task force, and he kept on sending me to represent UANP, but I understood only 30% of what the people were talking about, as I was only taking my, I just graduated from my master's degree back then. Of course, many other friends, of course, Secretary Sunny Viray also, and many of the other luminaries. Is there anyone here from the BSP? Wala. Sayang, no? Sayang. Okay. So, Ma'am Nene, and again, for those who I forgot, I'll try to remember later on. But again, just want to thank for all of those achievements, the 5 Ds, no? And we really feel that we owe you a lot, which led to, again, the PPPs, the BOTs of back then. But we would like to do more. And this is why I'm presenting these slides. I only have 10 minutes, and they say pictures paint 1,000 words, so I can say more using charts. And what this tells you is where the last 4 quarters of these components of GDP were, okay? If you add the last 4 quarters, how they compare with 2019. And among them, it's investment which is lagging. It's still 8% below pre-pandemic. And what I'd like to send a message here to the listeners and to those people in Zoom is that we need to fill up that gap, no, more quickly, because high growth, I think theory shows, requires strong capital formation, both public and private sector. Next slide, please, Joshelle. And if you compare the recovery of capital formation across the region, we are the ones that's lagging behind. Unfortunately, Vietnam is here. It's probably even higher up there if we had the data. No? But the point is we really want to participate some more in these PPPs. No? And again, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Hopefully, we can contribute further. Next, here you can see our capital formation numbers are historically lower than everybody else. Fortunately, we beat in Malaysia in this last print. No? But clearly, because we lagged behind so many years, so much catch up for. No? And again, we'd like the private sector to participate as much as we can. Next, how much time do I have? Still have time. Okay, and this is the other thing, competitiveness. We'd like to be able to contribute to improving competitiveness for our country, help the current NEDA team create the high-quality jobs that they're aspiring for. No? This would be very difficult if your business efficiency gauges, at least based on maybe a subjective assessment of the IMEDE, we are still bottom of the region in their latest survey. The next would show you infrastructure also still, unfortunately, at the bottom. But again, this is an opportunity, we think, for us to, again, cooperate and work together to be able to rebuild and catch up with our neighbors. No? So we're very proud of, for example, projects in Region 3. Big bridges are going to be built there. But Indonesia is actually building a bullet train. No? So in comparison to our neighbors, we're falling a little bit behind. So if we can do more, of course, it's best, to the best interest of everyone. Next, here's the overranking on competitiveness. So I think I showed that already. Next. Okay, now we move on to another separate topic. And, this chart gives you both, I guess, good news and bad news. The good news is on the right side. Okay, despite COVID, despite the global financial crisis in 2008, our non-performing loans in the industry, banking industry in particular, never really shot up to as high as the previous episodes. No? And comparing our banks to the rest of the region, it's very clear that we have made the banking system a lot stronger. But this was made possible by, unfortunately, some of the missteps that took place prior to that. They always say that, there's always this saying that I hear that, the only real mistakes that we make are those we don't learn from. No? And I guess this high NPL ratio of 1996 all the way up to 2002 really taught us a lot of things that made us more resilient or less vulnerable to the shocks of the global financial crisis in 2008, as well as the recent one from COVID. No? You know about SVB and all of these very fragile banks in the United States. They didn't have this rule that the Bangko Sentral implements here in the Philippines, that we very closely follow or very closely adhere to the LCR, no? The liquidity coverage ratio. If you look it up, it's very important, and SVB did not have that. That's why they had a problem in Silicon Valley. At any rate, so that's the two aspects of that chart. We learned a lot because of that problem. Now, how do you avoid committing that same mistake in 1999 all the way up to 2002, where our NPLs reached 20% of the loan book of banks back then, no? And the closure of Urban, the closure of Bank of Southeast Asia, and many other banks. No? Next. Well, those are the three elements. I believe if you look at them, they don't seem to be very harmful. But when you put all three of them together, okay, without any negative or bad intentions, they can actually be very dangerous. No? And these are virtual currency peg, which Secretary Habito already mentioned, a wide interest differential, which is almost always the case, where our interest rates are higher than US interest rates, and our persistent current account deficits. These three, if you put them all together, can lead to what Dr. Fabella has written in many of his papers and columns, unhedged foreign currency borrowings and currency mismatches in the balance sheets of both banks and private institutions. No? Believe it or not, there has been a tendency for the private sector to do this during times when the peso is appreciating. Many of the people in the sector are tempted to borrow foreign currencies when the peso is strengthening. No? But it's good that economists are around to remind us of the mistakes that we made back then, hopefully not committing them again. No? But let me just show you just a few more pictures before I end my presentation, or my reaction, which is, by the way, mostly about thanking the Ramos administration. So there's the first element, the interest differential. So the Philippine interest rate there is the blue one, and the US is the orange one, obviously. For most of the 80s and 90s, our interest rates were very, very volatile. And a big part of the 1990s was to defend the peso, to keep the peso very steady. Interest rates had to be very volatile. So what would the reaction of the private sector be? Okay, Governor Singson, what will we do? Okay, this is what you will do. If interest rates are high and they're volatile, borrow abroad. Okay, so that's what happened. And the next slide would show that. Next slide. Go ahead. Yeah, so this is the dollar peso, and that's the flatliner that Dr. Habito was talking about. Please click the next. Yeah, that's the flatliner. That's horizontal line, 2620 to 2640, I think. It was very stable then, and we were warning in the academic community about the dangers of doing this and how it can subject the financial system in the Philippines to vulnerability. But we didn't even imagine how bad it would be. But nonetheless, that's the second element. The first element is an interest differential. The second element is a very stable or steady, almost virtual peg currency policy. Next, the third element is having current account deficits. It's okay if you have an interest differential and that thing earlier, but the problem with the Philippines back then is we had recurring current account deficits. That means that we were actually building up our foreign exchange obligations. It would have been very different if we had current account surpluses. By the way, most recent numbers show that we've had quite a big amount of deficits in previous years. Next. So those three elements alone, even with good intentions on the part of the private sector, would have led us to this problem. So this is the, of course, basic balance sheet of a bank or an institution that borrows in dollars. What happens if they are told or recommended to borrow in foreign currency? So we'll assume all of the liabilities are peso. Please click the next slide. You add now US dollar liabilities at 2620. And because it's been at 2620 for a persistent number of months, even years, people will expect it to be that way for long. But what happens, because you have such huge current account deficits and you have to pay your external obligations, the exchange rate moves from 26 to a higher figure. And the next slide would show that if the dollar liabilities at 2620 suddenly become 65 billion or almost twice as big as the previous size of your liabilities, what happens to your balance sheet? Next slide, please. Your capital disappears. In fact, it could turn negative and cause you to become insolvent. So that's a very simple dynamic of having a fixed exchange rate and how it can lead to big banking fragility problems. So that can actually become negative. Next slide. Yeah, so pwede kang maging negative capital. I don't know if I still have more slides. Anyway, this is the dynamic. I won't explain them anymore. You can refer to them. We'll be giving away our slides. Next slide. But the bright side of this is we learned a lot of things. And because of these macroprudential measures that the BSP, especially under the watch of Saite Tanco, made us a lot more made us less vulnerable to the shocks that we've seen these past 2 to 3 decades. I don't need to discuss them in detail, but it's clear, for example, why you have to have a 25% limit lending to the property sector. Some banks actually lent more than half of their loan portfolio to property, such that when it crashed, they were so vulnerable to reversals. No? The same with the loan-to-value ratios. Banks then would lend to companies for property loans 100% of what the market value is. Now, so what happens when the price goes down? The market value of the property goes down. So that's why now banks try to limit lending to you market value at only 60%, so that you don't overexpose yourself to that. Of course, there's more, the LCR I talked to you about earlier, quarterly stress tests. No? Banks are asked to do quarterly scenario setting. No? What happens if the reserves of the BSP suddenly is cut to half from 100 to 50 billion? Okay? These kinds of simulations are done so that we can foresee the possibility of our capital being eroded by all of these developments. No? Anyway, we can talk about them in more detail because I am only limited to 10 minutes. I think that's my last slide, am I right? So just for the monetary policy, it was no longer, it was money supply which was being targeted by the BSP. Now it's an inflation target. And on top of that, our new governor, Eli Remolona, will be watching financial stability very well. And we're very lucky that he worked for the BIS for 14 years, or was that with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and then 19 years with the BIS. No? So he's really on top of these things. No? Okay, so I think my time is up. So I'd like to again thank you for giving me some time to share my thoughts, and thank Dr. Habito and even Ma'am Winnie, because they were really the transition government, no, that paved the way for Ramos and the rest. No? Again, standing on the shoulders of giants. Thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neri. Let's now hear from Dr. Ofreneo.
Okay, maraming salamat kay Dr. Cielito Habito. Maraming din pong salamat sa organizers for reminding me that I am a graduate na po ako ng School of Economics and Development Economics. Yeah, it was a program managed by a very good professor of mine, and Dr. Rosalinda Hidalgo. And she was the one who also helped our School of Industrial Relations in the development of the labor economics course in our school. So in our school, most of us are Keynesians, thanks to Dr. Hidalgo. Now, this, I think the team of Dr. Habito came on board at a very difficult time. I think he gave a very good presentation. The decade of the 1980s was really a lost decade, a turbulent decade, very divided Philippine society. You know what happened during the time of the last 6 years of Marcos Sr., 3 years of recession, culminating in 3 years of depression, and then you have the murder of Aquino, and then followed by CCA, not exactly a period of stability. You have a series of coup d'etat, and then in 1987, there was this massacre of over 100 peasant leaders near Malacanang, and of course the debt crisis, where you see, and many of us oppose her decision to honor the entire debt bequeathed by Marcos Sr. Now, one good thing with the entry of the Ramos administration is this, as discussed, this promise of stability. And to a certain extent, they succeeded. In particular, Ramos, a minority president, turned out to be a great consensus builder. And then, in particular, I think with the help of Dr. Habito, they promoted this partnership with CSO. I remember this social summit, and I remember being invited to some of this meeting, unlike what happened in the 1980s. Also, when Ramos took over, there were a lot of promise also, hope, pag-asa. And I was telling Dr. Talisayon, we were so enamored with that term, Philippines 2000, leapfrogging. Joe Almonte even sent us some drawing about the Philippines taking its central place in East Asia, not only in Southeast Asia. And he even drew a Carabao at the center. So there was this NICOD, a promise of NICOD. So to a certain extent, Ramos and of course his team managed to raise hopes. But as things turn out, there are some issues that we have to make a position. Me in particular, in 1994, we had this negotiation with the World Trade Organization, and I was very active in helping one senator in questioning the rush of ratifying the World Trade, our membership in the World Trade Organization. He managed to delay the Senate deliberations by 2 to 3 months, and the main issue we were raising is, where is the readiness program? And then later on, we learned that Thailand, which is a major exporting country, set tariffs that are lower than those that we committed to WTO. Also, later on, I learned that it took China 15 years to negotiate with, in relation to its membership in the WTO, because they were negotiating tariff line by tariff line, similar with in the case of Vietnam. 15 years, tariff line by tariff line. I talked to the investment director of Vietnam, and the reason is they have to find out, or they have to strategize in what areas they can excel. You don't liberalize things in a wholesale fashion, the entire industry or the entire agriculture. And this brings me to the problem we are facing now, because learning from that, you have the WTO ratification was followed, of course, by this agricultural ratification. And our farmers' organization, remember what happened, that starting in 1995, we became a net agriculture importing country. It became bigger and bigger. Yeah. And this contrast to the promises. We were given copies of the Department of Labor position, the Department of Agriculture position. By joining WTO, we would be able to create 500,000 new jobs a year in industry, 500,000 new jobs in agriculture a year, and so much value added and so on. And so that's the reason why, as Dr. Habito mentioned, these farmer organizations, over 100, I think the latest was 150 organizations, coalesced, and they managed to delay the ratification by over a year. And this was not discussed last year because of the election. But the government would have a difficult time winning this 100 plus organizations back to support this so-called trade reforms. I also wonder why whenever we talk of trade liberalization, immediately we call it reform. Reform can be more protection, strategizing, and so on. It doesn't have to be equated to liberalization per se. So now, let me also point out about the issue of, another issue is the deregulation and privatization. We agree that in some areas, these were helpful, like we deregulated the telecom industry, to a certain extent the aviation industry. But what happened in the power industry? What happened in the with this water service? We have managed to create new monopolies, and there's price gouging. You see, and this brings me to a topic that very close to my heart: manufacturing. One major reason why Vietnam is leaving us by a mile is because the cost of power is very high. I think at least 40% higher in the Philippines. And you see, in manufacturing, the cost of labor is just around 10%, but the cost of power is usually 30 to 40%. So that's one major reason why we have become uncompetitive. And I was introduced earlier that I served as Undersecretary in 1997-98. Yes, I served. It was at the height of the Asian financial crisis. Somehow, I think some people are telling me you're crazy. They are taking the job at the time of the crisis. But when I was there, it was very difficult because there was a wave of strikes, some very difficult strike, like the strike in the URC. I think 6 months they robbed the area, and then nobody could enter. And so the John Conway already filed for dissolution of the company. But because of our intervention, we were able to persuade them to rethink. But the problem is, this wave of strike was accompanied by a wave of factory closures. You can check the data. A wave of layoffs, wave of factory closures that lasted up to 2002 or 2003, and as a result of this, one outcome is there is a decline in labor militants in the Philippines. Why? Because the seat of unionism is manufacturing. And if your manufacturing is down. And in particular, two major industries that almost disappeared. One is the textile industry, and then the other, most of them are unionized. You see, this Eastwood used to be a textile area, and then the other industry is garments. The Philippines used to be one of the top 10 garment exporters in the world. Now, in 1996, I was part of a study group. We recommended to the government the only way forward for the Philippines to survive this agreement on clothing and textile is to upgrade, develop new materials. But the problem is that nothing was done. And so from almost, the industry used to have 1 million workers, now it's less than 100,000. And I was telling Donald D., the late Donald D., and his friends in the garments industry, we cannot win in this SOI, Save Our Industry proposal, because the proposal is duty-free importation of American textile and duty-free export of our garments. I said, this is not possible under the WTO. And in the case of China, despite numerous so many sanctions, is still able to beat Mexico, which enjoys duty-free treatment under the NAFTA agreement. So let me conclude, because I'm given only 5 or 7 minutes. I think I joined Dr. Habito that we need to be more ambitious in crafting, for our country. And the way forward, I think, is I think we should unite in sitting together and helping strategize economic development area by area. Let's forget some of this, some doctrinaire debates on liberalization, protectionism, etc. Let us unite and let us work as one Filipino nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ofreneo. We'll now hear from our final discussant, Dr. Serafin Talisayon.
Good afternoon. Dr. Habito started his talk by saying that we have to re-educate ourselves in the economic history of our country. And he did that very convincingly, and I really enjoy his talk, and I hope you did also. Because, you know, to be convincing, somebody told me, you have to do kwento at saka kwenta. And the statistics that he showed at the end of his presentation speaks for themselves. But medyo bitin ako dun sa kwento because you told us about nagtanan dito, pagkatapos sinermonan ka ng isang magnate who was also very happy afterwards. And so, sana mas marami kang kwento. Because that will really make us appreciate what happened during the 6 years you were the economic minister of our country, which is also coincides with the 6 years of the Ramos administration. So siguro magkukwento lang ako. Wala ako ritong papel, ano? So magkukwento lang ako because I am familiar with Philippines 2000. And let me start. There is a very interesting, very strong, very deep chemistry between former President Ramos and my former boss, General Jose Almonte. They were together as young graduates from PMA. Of course, Ramos was a few years ahead of my former boss, Almonte. They were together in Sierra Madre, asking very deep questions. Why are we trying to kill our fellow Filipinos? Then they were together again in Vietnam. They have been talking. They have been agonizing about the problems of our country. So, when they rose to higher positions, and I was very fortunate that I was tagging along, I could see how the dynamics between these two people work out in our, not only economic, but other policies. Okay. In 1988, up to 1992 during the campaign, I was fortunate to help, at that time, Commissioner of EEIB, Commissioner Almonte. EEIB is the defunct Economic Intelligence Investigation Bureau. And my task there was organize an economic research group, hire cum laudes from the UP School of Economics. I had to talk to 1988, Joy. Do you remember, Joy? I was talking with Joy at that time. We were both young at that time. Of course, he's younger. You know, also with the late Adel Ables. So we staffed that economic research group with the best. And you know the question that Joe Almonte gave us? Tell us, do research. Who owns the Philippines? So we have to study the banking cartel. We have to study the monopoly here and the monopoly there. We have to study why people do smuggling. You know, why high tariff rates lead to very happy smugglers and so on. I didn't intend to tell this, but give me 2 minutes. During the campaign, I was invited by Joe Almonte to attend a lunch. And, you know, we have lunch together very often, talking about the issues of the economy, EIIB. There were about 20 people there. I don't know who's the 20 people. I thought kaming dalawa lang. You know what? They were the top smugglers in the country. And they were offering 100 million pesos each for the campaign. Times 20, 2 billion. May sukli pa siya. Panalo na siya. Down. It was refused. Anyway, during the campaign, 1991, I was asked to take a leave without pay from UP Diliman. So I did. And my job was very simple. Siyempre, academic ako, research ang ginawa ko. My mission order is this. Go all over the country, convene small groups, and ask one question. If General Ramos, or at the time, Defense Secretary Ramos, became president, what policy would you like him to adopt? You know, in business, this is customer sensing. This is stakeholder sensing. Okay. 12 months. So after 12 months, we submitted our report. And by that time, he already won the election. Everybody was submitting reports. So I went back to my desk in UP Diliman. But after 1 week, oops, come back. He appointed me as Assistant Director-General for Policy of the National Security Council. My first job after I took that position is this. Gather together reform-minded undersecretaries, reform-minded CEOs in the private sector, reform-minded leaders in the civil service sector, civil service organization sector, and formulate a strategy for the 6 years of the Ramos administration. So we did. I have to obey. So I assembled. We met almost every week at NSC, very confidential, hush-hush. And we submitted our report before Christmas. And the following, right after New Year, he announced it, Philippines 2000. But I have a big problem. Because, bakit NSC ang gagawa ng Philippines 2000? Bakit hindi NEDA? I have to do something. So I have to see Secretary Shell Habito. Shell, alam mo ba, yung tatay mo, ninang ko sa kasal. Kinakapatid pala kita, sabi ni Shell. And that was the secret. After that, wala nang problema. Between NSC and NEDA. No? And also the other thing that contributed was because part of the 2,000 plus that formulated Philippines 2000 is that guy there, Chito Sobrepena. So the USEC of NEDA and the one who is coordinating with LEDAC, so siya yung connection ng NEDA sa legislative, siya din yung connection sa NSC. Si Chito. Okay, so that was how it was one. But let me end something. And this tells you the wisdom of my former boss, Almonte. And I wish he is here because he is the best person to talk what I'm talking about now. He knows more. No. Let me finish by this. You know, these 24 are so happy that their output became Philippines 2000. Ako ang real author niyan, hindi si Ramos. That's the danger. The danger that you will claim authorship. Not the president, but you know, the real author is the president. There's only one author. This is where, apinaliga, sabi ni Joe Almonte. Convene your group and ask them if they can subscribe to 3 principles. So I convened them. And I asked them if they can subscribe to these 3 principles. And they did. And for 6 years, we worked as an informal team promoting Philippines 2000 wherever we are. Coordinating, we are meeting very frequently for 6 years, but the press never knew. Why? The three principles are this: passion for passion for excellence, passion for the Filipino people, and number 3, passion for anonymity. So, the press never knew. And in the last year, the 6th year of the Ramos administration, there came a very short article speculating about, ano ba itong People's 2000 ito? Because we called ourselves, no, Chito, People's 2000. And we met very frequently, coordinating our work and so on. So, I don't know. Can I tell one more story? I don't know, do I have time? So we have to do a lot of things, and I will give you a glimpse of the things I have to do. No? You know, a professor from UP suddenly transported to Malacanang and made to do certain things. No? Okay. A little bit story. After the president announced Philippines 2000, what I had to do are the following. This is my own initiative. I called the president of the Hotel Association of the Philippines. I called the president of the Travel Agent Association. I called the president of the Association of Transport, you know, yung Transport for Hire, Restaurant Association, and so on. And, you know, pagka pala nasa Malacanang ka, nagtawag ka, takbuhan sila. I mean, my gosh, ganyan pala yung power. No? I feel something for the first time. Ganito pala yung merong, may influence. No? So, they came, no? And I told them, look, if we liberalize the airlines industry, the hotel, the restaurants, transportation, everything, it will blossom. You will grow. So they did a position paper supporting Philippines 2000. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Neri, Dr. Ofreneo, and Dr. Talisayon. Now we move forward to the part of the program which everyone is definitely most enthusiastic about, the open forum. May we ask Dr. Habito and the discussants to go back on stage to field questions from the group and from those who are joining us via Zoom. So the open forum will be done both on-site and online via Zoom. For our online on-site participants, in the middle of the aisle are microphone stands. If you want to ask a question or raise your comment or opinion about the discussions, line up please and wait for your turn. Don't forget to introduce yourself and provide your affiliation. Now for our online Zoom participants, kindly send your questions to the account name UPSE Zoom Facilitator. I'll be reading the questions and comments during the open forum. Gentlemen, please. Oh, meron na pala. Okay, nakapila na. Okay. Nahiya sila mag-occupy ng certain center. Please. Doctor. Yan, sige. Okay. Please state your name, your affiliation, and then your comment or question.
Hello. I'm Alex Escucha. In the previous sessions, nahuhuli ako kaya ngayon mauna na ako. It is my privilege to have served with Habito when he was president of the Philippine Economic Society. And I even had the privilege of attending your silver wedding anniversary pillar in the Makiling Art Center. And that is where I sat beside your father and he told me the story, how you got the name Cielito. Okay, but I will not tell that story. First of all, Thank you for that very insightful presentation. You're not glossing over the weaknesses and the mistakes. But since in general, and especially for those who have followed the wake of FBR and all the real nice tributes and the real opening up of the economy, in fact, on the telecom, Lee Kuan Yew had a favorite quotation about the Philippines, di ba? Half of the Philippines is waiting for a telephone line, the other half is waiting for a dial tone. And the Ramos administration really opened up that, and we have been getting the benefits of that. Since June and I are from the banking sector, I'd like to sort of focus 1 or 2 points on that. I would sort of disagree a bit on your comment that we were not as affected in terms of the Asian financial crisis. In relation to the slide shown by June, where the NPL ratios went as high as what, 14, 17%, no? I was telling Carl on the side that the crisis happened in 1997. The SPB law was passed only 3 years after that. And banking resumed its growth from pre-1997 days in 2005. So we actually lost 8 years of that. So that's a big part of the equation then. And you were correct that when there was a flat line of the foreign exchange, the hedge funds manager said this exchange rate is being managed, and they ganged up on us at the same time that George Soros was ganging up on Malaysia. And we really paid a lot on that. But not because of the fault of the Ramos administration. A big part of those bad loans was because the borrowers were lulled into complacency, both on the low interest rates on the foreign exchange loans and the steady forex rate, that many of the borrowers there, June remembers this, that yung walang foreign exchange proceeds were borrowing in dollars. So they were the ones hardest hit, and they were hit twice. One, when their obligations doubled the same dollar amount, and then interest rates went as high as 30 to 40% at some point. So from the frying pan to the fire talaga sila. Okay. Second point lang, Shell, is on and because you did try to, we were swinging on the energy front, we were swinging from one end to the other. In last month's session, I asked the question of my Ninang Winnie, if we had sort of repudiated the loan on the Bataan nuclear power plant, we could have really gotten that relief. But you could separate the repudiation of the loan from the act of actually still operating the nuclear power plant, and we would not have had the shortages that we had, which spilled over into the Ramos era. So we came from a pendulum on no power because of that decision, and then excess power naman because of those IPPs. And for the next 10 years, we were seeing in our bill the stranded cost on our Meralco bills because of that. But just to pin that down further, Shell, iba yung you provided additional power supply, but the component part, and this is relevant today because NGCP has still not provided the proper transmission. So we were putting up power plants na walang transmission line. They're producing power, pero it cannot be used by the public because there was no connection from the power plant to the transmission grid system. Diba? And I don't know who is accountable for that we approve these power plants without the necessary connection, or relating fast forward to today that there are power supplies generation, but NGCP is delayed in providing the proper transmission to harness all of that power. So I'm not putting down, but what is the lesson in that portion of both on the exchange rate management as well as on this energy situation as relevant to today's issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comment. I'd like to hear from the next participant. Okay.
Hello. Good afternoon. I am Emilio from Central Esguerra University Political Science Society. First, I would like to state that former President Dole Aquino was focused on restructuring the country's government. No. Meanwhile, former President Ramos focused on economic development along with strategies to unconventional tactics of literally heating up the cabinet members for consensus in policy making. However, I would agree with former DOLE Undersecretary Rene Ofreneo that there are certain areas of privatization would be beneficial for the nation. However, when it comes to the privatization of the utility system natin, which is the electricity and the water, I'd say when it comes to the monopoly busting that the Ramos administration had, the privatization of our utilities actually created more monopolies for the country when it comes to the utility system. I would like to even mention that the one company from Mindoro is not even in its capabilities of running the electricities in Mindoro. So my question would be, when it comes to the privatization of certain areas of our market, and including utilities, would you say, Dr. Habito, should have the utilities not been endorsed to the private sector, or should it be introduced at the first, or should the government manage or take hold of those utilities before sending it off to the private sector?
Okay. Dr. Shell.
Well, let me take on Alex's comments and questions first. On the exchange rate management, I'll go back to the blame I was getting from my friends in UP School of Economics. Bakit hindi ako nag-golf? Kaya ang pinakinggan, well, again, with all due respect to my former colleague, Gabi Singson, and admittedly, he had the upper hand in influencing the president. Notwithstanding that memo that I explained the whole thing, why it was destructive to have that flat line, still, I guess relations really mattered in the end, in the policy decisions. And I appreciate the fact, by the way, that the economic community were behind me in arguing that publicly at the time. But as you know, talagang ganun nangyari, and too many firms with no foreign exchange earnings borrowed foreign loans because they were encouraged by the central bank to do so on the basis of interest rates being lower for dollar loans. As if, and again, because of the time that it was being held constant, it was being portrayed that riskless itong kanitong klaseng borrowing. I mean, I saw that from inside one of the companies deeply affected by that. I was in the board of Steel Corp and Phil Steel Holdings, where they were in fact heavily burdened for many years by that ballooning of their indebtedness simply because they had a lot of these foreign loans. All I can say is we tried what we could to argue why we were going in the wrong direction, but in the end, that is one of those outcomes that we were not very happy about. Now, of course, on the power, the happy outcome now is that there are more economists at BSP. Apparently, there were not enough at the time who could guide the policy making at the top level at the time. In any case, on the power itself, well, you know, we who were part of the Ramos administration always go back to that argument that yes, it's so easy to look at hindsight with what happened about our entering into these IPPs and all that. But when we had our backs against the wall, the only thing to do really was to realize that no power is more expensive than high cost or high priced power. And at the same time, I also explained that truly we had in effect provided for capacity based on the growth trajectory that we were actually tracking, except suddenly things went haywire with the Asian financial crisis. And that was the reason why we had excess unused power at that time, which did not, as I said, did not last very long. But you're right, when I talked about being relatively unscathed, I was simply talking about GDP growth. But in terms of the deeper impacts on the economy, precisely because many firms were severely handicapped by the debt burden that resulted from taking on too much foreign borrowing, even without foreign revenues, then that indeed had in the end, perhaps you're right, you implying that in that sense, mas masama yung naging tama sa atin. Simply because our neighbors had better appreciation of the financial situation. Now, on the matter about privatization of utilities, well, let me make a disclosure. In fact, as mentioned, I was in the board of the Manila Water Company, and the metrics were clearly very inspiring to the point that it was hailed worldwide as a success story in water privatization. I mean, the problem is when the comparison that some critics tend to make does not consider what could have been if we did not privatize the water utilities at that time. And really what I fail to understand well enough is why so many people who are critical of privatization seem to have so much faith in government to run things well. But what prompted the Ramos administration to privatize precisely was because our water system, our NWSS was so deep in debt. In fact, our National Power Corporation was so deep in debt, the fiscal cost of it was just so tremendous that our consolidated public sector deficit that we inherited was really so dramatic. So these government-run utilities had become a real burden. And the only way was to let the private sector show them the way, show the otherwise government bureaucrats who would run these utilities the right way to run these facilities. So that was the whole argument behind that. So as I said, it's so easy to look with hindsight at the things that went wrong afterwards. No? But at that time, I remember how people were saying, look, tumaas din ang presyo ng tubig. But the question really was, what would have been the price of water had we not privatized? And it was very clear from the trends we were seeing before the privatization that we would have been a lot worse if we had not privatized. So, we would simply ask that we look at things in a more, shall we say, I was about to say, but let's look at it in a more objective way and look at the proper comparisons on the counterfactuals to that privatization. Yes, there were some failed such privatization, especially in other countries. And that's why naging unique nga yung Pilipinas. Sa atin lang, sabi ng world community, successful yung water privatization natin. But too many of us still in this country don't believe that that was a success. I thought it was. Remember? 65% non-revenue water, naibaba ng Manila Water to 8%. That was lower than the world average in non-revenue water, all these leakages and unpaid for water. So that was quite impressive in itself. No? We didn't have to build a new dam to be able to source more water. Just the savings from the lowering of the non-revenue water was equivalent to having a new dam opened up, because ang laki nung na-gain from this kind of efficiency that was improved by the private utilities. And again, you can see it from the comparison of the two utilities. I mean, with all due respect to the other water company, it was very clear. We were comparing notes. Capital expenditures of Manila Water was for replacing all the pipes. Capital expenditures on the other side was for buying vehicles and building buildings. So, well, of course, that's why up to now you can see that there's a bit of a comparison between the two. But in short, I still think on balance our experience was a positive one.
Okay, thank you. Before I call the next participant for the comment or question, I'd like to read the question from one of our participants from Zoom. By the way, we only have 20 minutes for this entire open forum, unfortunately, so kindly keep your questions and comments shorter. Okay, a question from Dr. Maria Socorro Bautista. What did FBR do to the MUP pensions during his time? Did indexing pensions to the rank of the current position holder start during the FBR period? What is his view on the push of the current administration to make the MUP contribute to the pension system and not index pensions anymore to current position holders? I think it's a very important topic that we should tackle.
Well, I'll be very honest about this. I was not quite abreast of what was happening on the military pension system at that time. So I could not answer categorically whether the problem started during the Ramos administration or even before, because I have a suspicion it was during the martial law years when, as we all know, the military was sort of pampered in quotes, and part of the sweeteners may have been precisely this kind of pension system that was actually onerous to the national finances.
Okay. Go ahead. Who's next?
So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Mr. Habito. I am Mark Lester Rosales from IRIS, and I am a second-year public administration student. So, I just want to know your opinion about what if the Mandanas and Garcia ruling exist on the time of President Ramos for the... Kanina po nabasa ko and in-explain nyo din po yung about sa Mindanao 2000. So what if po kung nag-exist po ang Mandanas and Garcia ruling at that time, and do you think po ba na magkakaroon po ng magandang pagbabago kaagad ang Mindanao during that time? Yan lang po. Thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Well, as you know, the Mandanas-Garcia ruling simply, the big change that happened there was that even the customs revenues are now part of the computation of the internal revenue allotment. Of course, that led to some kind of a windfall in the shares of the national revenues being received by the local governments. I have always been a believer in local governments, knowing, of course, that there's still a lot of problems down there. But I guess my own faith comes from having been part of the Galing Pook Foundation, having been the chairman of the judges, in fact, for Galing Pook Awards for 4 years. There's a lot of good things happening at the local level. And so I'm really a believer in subsidiarity, in devolution. If it happened, if the Mandanas, if the customs revenues were part of those revenues back then, well, one of the things I can say is that we would have had tremendous national fiscal problems, because the national government agencies needed money. And at that time, in fact, our consolidated public sector deficit was still rather large. And binawasan mo pa yung resources at the disposal of the national agencies, talagang magkakaproblema. And as we all know, with the devolution, there was, of course, the internal revenue allocation. So there was a change from suddenly a lot of money now going to the LGU, supposedly. Pero ang nangyari nga is kulang nga din, no? Ang nangyari. Because too much precise, well, in health, for example, too much was devolved, pinasa sa kanila yung mga ospital, hindi naman kaya doon sa binigay na pera kanila. Yeah. So binalik ulit sa national government. But in the Department of Agriculture, people were not doing their homework in terms of enabling and capacitating the local governments to take on the work of the Department of Agriculture. This is my biggest lament right now. Nung nagka-devolution noong 1991, the attitude of the DA was, oh sige, bahala kayo sa buhay nyo. Devolve na eh. When I argue that they should have taken it to be the responsibility to train the local governments to handle agricultural development. Hindi yung sabihin, sige, bahala kayo. And then they continued to run national agricultural programs from the top. And that's why we had fertilizer scams and Napole scams. Top-down pa rin. And that's what I was mentioning in my presentation. In spite of devolution, agriculture was not really devolved because, now, number one, DA refused to even help the LGUs do their work. And secondly, they insisted in still doing things centrally. And I have stories to tell here, but they don't have time, but just showing how, in fact, that central top-down handling of agriculture by DA was really, what really has been, shall we say, burdening our farmers up to today and putting them deeper and deeper into poverty. So in the end, my conclusion has been the biggest problem in agriculture is the institution itself. It's not lack of technology, it's not lack of know-how, it's the fact that the bureaucracy, the devolution was never done properly with the right coordination and partnership between the DA and the local governments. We are doing our best to fix that now. I'm part of a study that is pushing a province-led agriculture fisheries extension system where they will really have to work really close together. But in any case, the resources that came from the Mandanas Ruri, sabi ko, hindi mangyayaring ibibigay nila sa agriculture yan. Dahil ang paborito pa rin ng ating mga local chief executives, mga monuments, mga ospital, mga multi-purpose pavements, which means basketball courts na patuyuan daw ng palay, waiting sheds, bus terminals, rather than helping farmers be more productive and make food cheaper in the country and therefore reduce the kind of malnutrition and stunting we're seeing today.
Okay. Before I read the next question, can I ask a brief follow-up to that? The issue of devolution. Given your experience with devolution during the 90s, I think some of the comments were that a lot of responsibilities were given or downloaded to the LGUs, but not enough resources, not enough training, as you mentioned. Given that experience, should we proceed further with this devolution and this principle of subsidiarity, meaning federalism?
No, not to the point of federalism, but certainly with the Mandanas Garcia ruling, I would assert again the responsibility of the national government departments to take it as their responsibility to help and capacitate the local governments do the work that has been devolved to them. Not have the attitude of bahala kayo sa buhay nyo. That is, I think, the biggest problem that we had with devolution.
Okay. A question from Professor Emilio Javier. Market liberalization is crucial but obviously not enough. Vietnam was a very latecomer, yet they appear to be overachieving. So the question is, what lessons can be drawn from the Vietnam experience?
Well, I think Vietnam's success is largely because of far superior governance than we have. It's not about liberalization, it's not about even technical know-how, but the fact is, when they say they need to do something and they want to do something, they do it. When they declared they were going to be the number one exporter of coffee in the early 2000s, they did it. But in our case, we can't seem to get our act together in a government that finds coordination very, very difficult.
As you mentioned, the dysfunctional government system, okay, political system.
Yeah, just a little comment about Vietnam. In Vietnam, the government is really in the saddle and giving supervision framework. And in Vietnam, the biggest bank is the Agri-Bank with over 100,000 employees. And they go out in the field and really talk to the farmers. You see, the problem in the Philippines is we have this agri-lending that is very remote to many farmers. And it's not related even to agri-farm planning. So I think when you talk about extension, I think we should transform our farmers into be modern agri-business producers. I mean, agribusiness should not mean to be San Miguel or the big corporations, the small farmers. And that's what's happening in our neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Offie Templo. I think many of you, the older ones, know me. But the younger ones, siguro hindi nyo kilala. I was the great alalay of Dr. Habito at the time. Congratulations to the three because I really enjoyed listening to the four of you. I'd like to start with the presentation of June. Kasi si June's presentation, picturing the Philippines, where we are right now, reminds me of where we were during the start of the Ramos administration. So in my 20 years of NEDA, frankly, after 10 years, when President Ramos took over, I never imagined that we were kasi the sick man of Asia at the time. And in 6 years, we became the rising tiger of Asia. So, and the presentation of APIN reminded me of the fact that President Ramos was a visionary, which I never saw in the succeeding presidents or even in the past presidents. No? And part of the success, perhaps, was because there was a General Almonte. And I read who was like, looking very forward-looking. And if I imagine him now, he would probably be pushing for electric cars being produced here. So I read some of the reports of APIN, and I could see that we as bureaucrats at that time never thought the way they were thinking. They were very much ahead. So I think my question is to Shell and to APIN. Part of the success was really having somebody who has that kind of vision, and at the same time, very grounded. So President Ramos was like, I saw him, in the labor summits, di ba, Mr. Rene? At the sideline, talagang inaayos na niya si labor sector. So pagdating dun sa summit, ayos na. So parang up and down. You have, and even the cabinet members, talagang siya yung may nagbabaston. So where we are right now, my question is, do we have hope that in the next 6 years, we will have a repeat of the Ramos administration, where we are at the bottom, pwede ba tayong maging medyo rising naman, hindi na bottom. And then institutionally, kasi merong parang hindi naman cabinet, but merong talaga merong somebody who's thinking way ahead of the others. Meron bang institutionally, what does this administration need to do in order to match that stint of President Ramos?
Very tough question, but very relevant.
Salamat, Ofi. 6 years is not enough for a good president, but too long for a bad president. During the later part of the 6 years administration of President Ramos, there was a movement, charter change, so that he can go beyond 6 years. Cha-cha, they call it, charter change, cha-cha. And I observed at very close range, President Ramos was just not saying what is his position. So umaandar yung cha-cha. Because once we reach the 6th year, in my own personal estimate, we have achieved only 60% of our target. There are many things we wanted to do. Dreams of the President and my boss, Almonte. I know some of them, and they have not been realized. 60% lang, so sayang 40 years. But not at the last moment, sabi ni Presidente, stop that cha-cha. Because he said, it will create the wrong president. So he stopped the whole thing. And so we were succeeded by another president who undid a lot of the things that we did. So sayang na sayang. Sayang na sayang.
Yeah, but on the question of whether is there, in fact, somebody like Joel, or was there in subsequent presidents, parang yun that seems to be the lack. No? I mean, we really need to have a visionary group within the government, ideally, but also possibly outside as a think tank, but is really used and listened to by the government. Now, at this point in time, I'm not sure that there is such a thing. But that's the reason, like I said, early on, I recognized and I realized the need to have a close relationship with Joel and Apin and everybody else that they were working with. Because you need a combination of long-term strategic thinking along with the firefighting that cabinet members also have to spend a lot of their time on.
2 minutes, Shell. You know, we talk about inclusive development. Inclusive, no? Masyadong nandito, no? But let me tell you a little story. One time, Joe Almonte cannot attend the cabinet meeting. So I was asked to attend in this place. And siyempre, very low level ako, I'm just listening. The cabinet was debating whether to have peace talks with Nur Miswari or not. Some cabinet members said, no, he's an SOB. We should not negotiate with him. But other cabinet members, let's go ahead with the peace talks with Nur Miswari. And the president were just listening and watching. And then finally he said, yes, he is an SOB, but we want him to be our SOB. In other words, very inclusive ang kanyang puso. He is not somebody else. He is our anak, our son that we want to bring back home. Make him our SOB.
Thank you. Next, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Rene Ofreneo, currently taking up Peace Economics at University of the Philippines, Los Baños. And I would like to ask, since China is known to devalue its yuan, and as a result it attracts foreign investors and increases their exports, is that something the Philippines can do anytime soon, or are we not capable of doing it yet? Thank you.
Well, all I can say is that we economists have long been arguing that perhaps we should undervalue our currency because it was overvalued for far too long. And that, again, that's one of the major reasons why we are where we are now. Indonesia, at some point, deliberately undervalued their currency to be able to gain export competitiveness. China, of course, has been accused by Trump as a currency manipulator precisely because of that kind of policy. It could actually work for us, but in the end, our BSP is independent. And in the end, it is they who have to determine whether we would like to have a policy that would lead to that kind of undervaluation.
Okay.
Can I add a comment on the
Go ahead.
devaluation? I think for China, they're known to be centrally managed, and it's very easy to understand if they don't use market-based regulation or participation of the Bangko Sentral. In our case, one way of doing that is when the currency is being pressured to strengthen, meaning dollar peso now 55 being pressured to go to 49 or 50, what the BSP had been doing during Saita Tangco's time was to rebuild our foreign currencies. No? So that's one way of preventing the sharp appreciation of the peso. Or if you hit a certain, for example, we hit 58 last year. So happy sana yung mga OFWs. And what the BSP could have done is bought dollars at 58 and kept buying, preventing it from going down to 55 or 54. So that's one indirect way of doing it, using market-based rules. Hindi yung sasabihin lang na bawal mag-trade anywhere below 58. So I guess that's from the perspective of someone working in the treasury group of the bank. Thank you.
Thank you. Like to comment? Go ahead.
SP is actually just reacting to what Neri is saying about being behind the curve with the U.S. Federal Reserve. Kaya nag-react yung monetary board sa iyo eh. Anyway, if this is the last question, I'd like to, since NEDA is been in the business of preparing development plans, 5-year plans, di ba? And I'd like, sometimes I seem to think that the development plans, once written, fall into the category of a classic, something you've heard about but never read. And I've read PDP 2017 to 2022, 533 pages. and then the 2023 to 2028, 430 pages. And relative to the question of OFI, na yung may long-term vision about where we want to be, to go beyond the 6-year limit, is there an opportunity here? Because when RC was Pinoy's NEDA Secretary, he formulated the Ambition 2040, di ba? And now he's in a position to have that continuity. And unlike in the Pinoy GMA period where at the start of the administration, they throw everything that the previous administration did, di ba? Lalo nang kila Pinoy, I mean, everything was stopped. Pagdating naman kay Duterte, the PPP was stopped. And so you literally lose 1 year at the start of... In the case of the current administration, they basically just continued what was being done, especially, for example, infra to GDP spending of 4 to 5% versus 2% in the previous years. So the question is, Shell, do you think there's an opportunity for RC to really sort of make it a go na given build on the previous PDP in the context of this longer 2040, Ambition 2040, and really make it happen in that context? Because that's the closest thing you have to having a more than 6-year execution timeline. Thank you.
Well, I guess the direction should be to, again, formulate a long-term plan, which is, as I said, President Ramos mandated or instructed NEDA to do that. So we produced that Plan 21. To some extent, ang problema na upstage o na overshadow yung Plan 21 ni Ramos and people confused it with Philippine Agenda 21, which was formulated by the Philippine Council for Sustainable Development. Halos nagkasabay yung release nung dalawa eh. So the Plan 21, whose cover I showed you in one of my slides, talagang was virtually forgotten. And by the way, OFI was the one shepherding that. Kasi that was the first time that NEDA actually was instructed by the President to produce a plan that transcends administrations. Sana, kung magawa uli yun, at the same time talagang succeeding administrations will adhere to it and would pay attention to it, then we could have the continuity that you and I hope to see more in our government. Yun ang problema nga eh. We all know that that's the problem. Every presidency wants to make its own mark, and that can mean completely undoing what has been done in the past administration. Hindi sana ganon. But there's a little bit of reassurance here. The way NEDA works, and I hope they still work that way now, is even before the next election, at least 6 months before the election, nagsisimula na yung NEDA staff on the beginnings of the next round of the medium-term development plan. By the way, nung panahon ni Don, inalis niya yung MT. Kasi natukso siya. Well, it was I who wrote in my column na medyo napikon yata siya na some people are criticizing it as an empty, as in EMPTY, Philippine Development Plan. So Don decided, sige, alisin na natin yung MT, yung medium term. Let's just call it the PDP. But anyway, the Philippine Development Plan is something that should be guided by a longer-term planning perspective. And that is what President Ramos sought to do when he instructed us to draw up a 25-year plan, which, as I said, unfortunately fell by the wayside for some reason.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's the end of our open forum. We would like to thank our speakers, our discussants. For our discussants, you may return to your seats. Pero please stay put si Dr. Habito. Now, for those questions and comments which were not read, you may send them to this email, upsepublicaffairs.upd@up.edu.ph. Before we end, we'd like to present Dr. Habito with a token of appreciation. May I request Dean and PCED Executive Director, Dr. Joy Abrenica, and Dr. Carl Robert Handok, Chair of the UPSC, to join us on stage. So, Dr. Habito, we present to you Vignettes of Yesterday, a painting by artist James Gabito. Vignettes of Yesterday is an essential recreation of the past, derived from the artist's sentiments of life and culture in a time-bound costume and setting. the artist keeps the spirit of Old Manila intact through its own adroit visualizations, culminating perceptions and interpretations. This art piece is from the collections of Gallery Joaquin. On behalf of the UP School of Economics and the Philippine Center for Economic Development, we thank you, Dr. Cielito Habito. Now for some final announcements, on your screen, the schedule of the rest of the 50 Years of Economic Policy Making lecture series. We hope to see you on August 18 for Dr. Felipe Medallas' lecture. We also are conducting a feedback survey. Kindly fill out the survey form and help us with your responses. With that, we would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Snacks will be served shortly. Again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.